and slightly different, as you see, different colour, slightly shorter, but hopefully we'll get through this just as well as he would. Today we're joined by none other than William Pike. William, welcome.
Hi.
Good to have you here.
Thanks.
Everyone knows you. You're the chap behind the Star newspaper. Lots to talk about today.
Looking forward to it.
It's quite odd coming on a rival station, but
The Standard and Radio Africa are not rivals. We're now partners.
Oh.
They're partners on Bamba Television.
Yeah.
We're going to be partners on a new sports TV station.
so Jeff will still have his job after this, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Very good. Well, listen, lots to talk about today. I think one of the issues is people want to know about papers. You're the paper guru of Kenya. You're known as one of the sort of magnets in terms of having arrived and just produced this wonderful newspaper, which is now number 3 in Kenya. But let's go way back. How did you get involved first of all in Africa? Because I know you were born in Tanzania, but how did you end up back here?
It's a long and convoluted story.
Yeah.
But first of all, my father was a colonial officer, like your father.
Yep.
And I was born in Tanzania in 1952.
Yeah.
When my dad was the provincial commissioner of southern province of Tanganyika.
Very important person.
He was, yes, he was somehow, he then went on to become Minister of Lands and Mines in Tanganyika as well, but he was old when, just like your father as well, I think.
Well, don't give him too much information about me, otherwise, there won't be much left.
I'm his first child and he was 49.
Gosh.
So he retired relatively early, before independence, and we went back to England. I grew up in England.
Did he retire because he had been in charge of mines and minerals? Is that
No, because actually I think, as you probably know, all these colonial civil servants were scrupulously honest.
Yeah.
But I always wanted to come back to Africa.
Yeah.
And after I became a journalist, after I graduated and became a journalist, I started specializing in African politics. Write about it in London.
But you did some quite boring things. You wrote for the Quantity Surveyor magazine or something ghastly.
Oh, how did you? Anyway, you've been doing your. No, so when
NIS send it across just now.
Oh, okay.
We'll talk about that later.
But no, when you get into journalism, in the old days in England, there was 2 ways of getting in.
Yeah.
One was to go and work on regional newspapers, and one was to go and work on trade newspapers.
Right.
There were no journalism undergraduate courses.
Right.
And even the graduate courses were just starting when I was there.
It makes it sound ages ago. This is only in the sort of 70s.
It was 1979.
79. Well,
Yeah,
80s, yeah.
So quite a long time ago.
And then,
but then I started specialising in Africa.
Yeah.
And I went in 1982. I left those trade magazines and went and worked for 6 months as a freelance journalist in Tanzania then.
Yeah.
And but it was really hopeless. It was the bottom point, the nadir of Tanzania's economy and politics. And so I despaired. And then I went to do a master's at SOAS, School of Oriental and African
So you got a legitimate
Studies.
qualification?
Yeah, a master's, a genuine, not from British Virgin Islands. And in the coffee room there, I met Ugandan exiles.
And one of whom was...
And I became friends with them.
Yeah.
And one of them turned out to be the London representative of the National Resistance Army, which was Museveni's guerrillas.
Yeah.
In fact, at that stage it was called the Popular Resistance Army.
Right.
And I became a very close friend of his.
Yeah.
And to cut a long story short, I went to visit the guerrillas in the bush in 1984.
Hang on, you've got to clarify for some of these people, you went to visit guerrillas with a U and not an O. Some people might think he went on holiday, and why would he do that? But guerrillas, as in
Museveni.
Yeah.
And actually, I had to pass through Nairobi, and in those days, you had to be undercover because the Kenyan secret police were arresting Ugandans involved with the guerrillas and deporting them back to Uganda. So one had to be slightly undercover in Nairobi. And but I went to Uganda, interviewed Museveni, first journalist to interview Museveni.
That was a big scoop back then. I mean, Museveni was in the Luwero Triangle at the time, and he was...
So I was the first person to see Museveni for 2 years.
Well, obviously the first journalist. You must have seen other human beings.
Yeah.
Imagine you're a bit fond of
So So then I got back to England, and I'd also had lots of evidence of all the massacres.
Yeah.
So it was a huge story.
Yeah.
And it was on the front page of the Observer, the front page of so many newspapers in the world, because the British government was having an argument with the American government at the time. The British government was claiming there weren't that many people killed, and the CIA was claiming 140,000 people had been killed in Luwero. But I came back and I said, actually it's not 140,000, it's probably at least 300,000, because I'd seen just hundreds and thousands of dead bodies myself. So it became a very big international
story.
Could
I just pause you there? I mean, you arrive in Luwero Triangle, you've got Museveni who's fighting this guerrilla war, doesn't know how it's going to turn up. You turn up, you interview him ahead of all the other hacks. And at what stage did you end up with a rapport such that a few years later he calls you in and says, do you want to help set up a newspaper?
Well, I became a kind of convert while I was in the bush. I was there for 2 weeks, and then they were taking care of me for another week in Kampala and Entebbe in clandestine units. But I was 2 weeks in the bush. By the time I came out, I was sort of like a convert.
You believed NRM, NRA, the future of democracy.
And it was the most intense experience of my life. And for 6 months after I went back to England, every night I would dream I was in Luwero. It was incredibly intense because it was very dangerous. And we were shelled by North Koreans. We fell into ambushes. There were all these dead bodies everywhere, and then there were these guerrillas who were a mixture of university students and peasants. And they were all so passionate and dedicated, so honest, decent, idealistic. Obviously, when they came to power, there was slippage. But in the bush, it was so intense and so perfect. It's very, very difficult to describe. But can I just ask you? Museveni
at that time, paint a picture of what he was like then, as opposed to now, perhaps.
Museveni was anyway. It's unfortunate he overstayed in power, I think, but he was something like a genius. He was a truly inspirational, charismatic leader, a visionary, very intelligent, very articulate. So when I got to meet him, I spent 2 days talking to him. I did hours and hours of interviews with him for the BBC. But I think some of the famous pictures you may have seen of Museveni with a combat cap and camouflage uniform, sitting around a kind of little grass shack in the bush. Those are my photos. He was a wonderful, charming person. He's still a wonderful, charming person.
If you're on the right side of him.
But no, what I was going to say. What I was going to say is if you look at what Besigye, Colonel Besigye. By the way, my feet had swollen to that. I walked to see Museveni. I walked 120 kilometers in 2.5 days, and by the time I got to Museveni in north of the Luwero Triangle, my ankles had swollen to that size.
Gosh.
Colonel Besigye was Museveni's doctor. He was the one who put bandages and stuff on my ankles.
Did he whisper in your ear, one day in 30 years time we're going to go for it?
No, I sometimes wonder about that. But if you look at Besigye, when he's so critical of Museveni, you will never hear him any criticism of what happened in the bush. Because what happened in the bush was a really perfect and great experience.
Okay, well let's move forward now to Museveni 1, ends up in power. You got a phone call one day saying Museveni remembers you'd like to see you, or you'd been pen pals, or what happened?
No, I was at my desk. At that time I was working for a magazine called South, and I was at my desk, and I actually the phone call actually came from Maria Katagaya, who was the number 2 in the movement. and he passed away a couple of years ago in Nairobi Hospital, but he was a great friend of mine. I got a phone call from Aria saying the cabinet has just been sitting and we're deciding to set up a new newspaper called New Vision. Would you like to come and be the editor? And so I said, give me 24 hours to think about it.
Inside you already knew, presumably.
Inside I knew.
Maybe cool a little
but yeah, after 24 hours I consulted a few people, including one of the people I consulted was Honourable Yusuf Hassan, MP for Kamakunji.
Interesting.
Because at that stage he was a Kenya exile in London.
Yeah, he was one of the naughty boys back in the day.
Yes. So I went and met him at King's Cross Station. I said, Yusuf, what do you think? Should I take this job? Yusuf said, get guarantees that you'll have freedom of expression and then go for it.
So, and you took it up, 21 years running that paper.
Yes.
Quite amazing.
No, it was a great experience. That was also a wonderful opportunity and a privilege to do that. And it was one of the interesting things about doing that job is here, if there's a problem with the Star and they do a story and people don't like it, one doesn't have so much authority. But there was a big difference between politicians who'd been in the bush, and there was a big dividing line if you'd been in the bush or if you'd not been in the bush. And if you'd been in the bush, you had clout, and if you hadn't been in the bush, you had less clout. And fortunately for me, I had been in the bush. It counted as being in the bush. So sometimes the minister could be annoyed with me because of something we'd published in the newspaper.
You had the president's ear, basically.
Yes, we also had the support of the president.
I'm just going to pause you there just to remind people the hashtag, which is this man Pike. Very easy to remember. And do get that out there. We've had already some wonderful feedback. We'll come on to some of the questions. But this man Pike, let's go back to this man Museveni. You had his ear. There has been a lot of suggestion that basically you're a government propagandist. All you did was roll out government stories and did talk about some of the atrocities the government were doing. But how do you counter that sort of discussion?
There was a competing newspaper, the Monitor, which was originally the Weekly Topic, and then it became the Monitor. The Monitor was run by Charles Abo, who's now works for The Nation, and Wafula Ogutu, who then until recently was the leader of the opposition. New Vision always outsold them.
And that's through choice? Or people had to buy the paper?
You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. If people had the choice to buy Monitor or New Vision, they chose to buy the New Vision. And so many times the ambassadors in Uganda asked me the same question, and I'd say to them, tell me one story that should have been in the newspapers or in the New Vision that has not been there. They were always tongue-tied.
But the one which I know people often mention is what's his name, Fred Wigwe, the RPF chap who was
Fred Rujema.
who was assassinated. And apparently there was a big hue at the time that the New Vision didn't cover that story.
No. That's going back to 1990 in the invasion of Rwanda. We covered it in detail. In fact, I think the true story was actually in New Vision, and I don't.
Who actually killed him? So just a sort of bit of background. That was the catalyst for the genocide, wasn't it?
No. The catalyst for the genocide.
I'm learning things, guys. I'm learning things.
The catalyst for the genocide was the shooting down of President Habyarimana's plane.
Right.
But what happened was that Fred Rujema, who, by the way, was also a close personal friend of both myself and my wife, was shot at the border. Museveni had called Fred Rujema and said, look, you've got to stop. It's going to cause a catastrophe if you invade. Fred Rujema said...
He was heading the RPF at the time.
He was leading the RPF. He led the invasion. Fred Rujema told the other RPF officers, I think we should stop. This man has been our protector. We should listen to him. And then another officer called Peter Bayingana just pulled out a gun and just shot him. Like that. And then they dumped him in a swamp. They called...
For a minute you had something there. I was about to leg it out of here.
They called Paul Kagame, who was on a training course in Fort Leavenworth in America. He came back.
And he shot them, didn't he?
He found, Koinange and one other officer, and he shot them, took control of the RPF, and then somehow the rest is history.
All right, well, listen, we could talk about that till the cows come home, and we'll afterwards. But 21 years later, you left. You left through choice, you were kicked out, you resigned, you felt it was going the wrong direction. No one leaves a job after 21 years, certainly not in Kenya, unless you're pushed.
The truth is that I ran the New Vision as the MD for 20 years, 21 years. Yeah. It's a really long time, Chris, and I don't think, I mean, it was time for a change. It was a time for a change for me.
Yeah. Were you married at this stage, by the way?
Yeah.
So you had a chairman to report to as well. It wasn't a unilateral decision.
But I somehow, it was time to go because Museveni wanted a kind of, he thought that, it's true that he thought that the New Vision was too critical and wasn't supportive enough.
And the other side was that you'd become Radio Moscow, Voice of America for the government.
No, but you see, the thing is, it was a government newspaper, and I was an NRM supporter.
Yeah.
And the NRM was the most popular party in Uganda. So you could still be a popular newspaper and be supporting the government. Yeah. But I always said it was a government newspaper in the way that the BBC is a state organ in the UK. Not like Radio Moscow or Voice of America, which were crude propaganda. Yeah. New Vision was subtle propaganda, like the BBC.
Well, I like the subtle propaganda bit there, because that's the whole discussion of whether in Kenya, coming up to election, you will touch on at the end, but there's the perception that different newspapers favour different particular political ideologies, if we have ideologies, that is. But one question I'd like to ask as we wrap up your Uganda time was the difference between doing business in Uganda then and doing business in Kenya now. I mean, was it chalk and cheese?
The one key difference is that I think in Kenya, if you're a foreign investor, you need to have a local partner. In Uganda, you can operate without a local partner. You can. By the way,
just to clarify for some of my friends who are listening, he means business partner, because some of them will rush off and get girlfriends immediately. I know what you meant, but I need to clarify for some of them.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, all right. Sorry about that.
And no, so you don't need. You can start a business in Uganda without having a local partner, and you can. And like, for instance, after Patrick Kwaku and I started Capital Radio, we'd asked Museveni's brother. We went around looking for people to be shareholders before we started Capital Radio in 1993.
That's Capital Radio Uganda, just
Capital Radio Uganda, which was the seed that led to Radio Africa here.
Over here.
And one of the people we offered shares to was Salim Saleh, Museveni's brother. Yeah. And he said, no, I don't think so. You know, and then 6 months after we launched, I bumped into him in a restaurant. He said, William, I've changed my mind. Can I have some shares? Yeah. I said, Saleh, it's too late.
He's kicking himself now, especially.
No, but you see, the thing is, he didn't try and muscle in and say, you should give me some shares. You've got to give me some shares, which is kind of the thing that can sometimes happen in Kenya. So I think that's one of the differences between Uganda and Kenya.
We'll come back and talk about other things, because I want to now talk about how you ended up setting up this wonderful paper in Kenya and the beginning of Radio Africa. But before we do that, we're going to have a break. And just to remind you, you're watching Jeff Koinange Live. I'm Chris Foot, at CK Foot. Do send us questions. We've got at William Pike here as well. This man Pike is, the hashtag as they're giving you is this man Pike.
Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
Who you Pike?
I know. Who you Pike? Who you Pike? Anyway, we'll join you very shortly after the break. Have a good one. We'll be back shortly.
People say they can't have cold drinks anymore because they don't want to feel that twinge if the taste of ice cream or a sip of coffee